Welcome back to the Stronger by Science podcast, aka the Muscle and Feels Stronger by Science podcast. This is the second time we make this joke, and from what I know, this also will be the last time, at least for a while, as the famous or infamous, as he'd prefer, Greg Knuckles will be making his return soon. I am Dr. Pak.
I'm Dr. Milo Wolf.
And as noted, this is the Stronger by Science podcast. So we are here today for a banger episode on time-efficient training. When it comes to time efficiency, and we'll touch on why it's important later on in the episode, but it is arguably one of these topics that that are prevalent multiple times, regardless of one's training age, training status, goals, size, and so on and so forth. Everybody wants to make gains, but nobody has time, and ain't nobody got time to be in the gym for 4 hours per session. But before we get into it, let's just touch on what we've been up to in the past couple of weeks. So I'll start with you, Dr. Wolf, not like there's anybody else besides you here. Or maybe there is. What have you been up to the past few days?
Yeah, so I've been keeping it tight in the gym, using some of these time efficiency hacks, because we've both been working quite hard. In fact, as the listeners may or may not know, we've both been hosting, although predominantly you, the gracious Eric Helms in the UK here. And so we've got some content coming out, on the YouTube channel with Strong by Science feat Eric Helms. So you can all look forward to that. But besides that, we're just getting ready for another trip to the US. We're seeing off the range of motion study we previously alluded to. And so right now we're in a weird interim phase where we're back in the UK for a couple of weeks, just making sure everything stays afloat as far as the research side of things, the content side of things, just keeping up with all responsibilities. But it's been a good time, and I've been applying some of these time-efficient hacks that we'll get into later in this podcast episode. How about yourself? Have you been incorporating any of these hacks, and how have the past couple weeks been for you?
Yeah, exactly the same situation over here. So we had the good Dr. Eric Helms in the UK for a whole week because we were both presenting at the British Powerlifting Conference here in London. And despite both of us being super busy, I'm not sure how many training sessions you managed to get in every week, but I still managed to get my 4 to 5 sessions in, despite being exceptionally busy and having Dr. Eric Helms as a guest here, which was a positive from a training perspective because she always wanted to train. However, time was limited and we had to make things work. As far as any major updates, nothing crazy, just looking forward to going back to New York and seeing off the study. We should be able to share some preliminary or even close to final results in the next couple of months with everyone. I'm not sure if you'll get to hear about the findings of the study before the preprint is out, but there's a chance that you may. Exciting stuff. For those of you that may not know, it is a study on full range of motion versus partials at long muscle lengths in trained participants on the upper body musculature, and it is all being done at the Lehman College Applied Muscle Development Lab. But yes, it's been a heavy period. However, gains are still being made. We're still after it, both for health, physical and mental, but also for the gains themselves. Other than that, we're off in a few days, back in the land of the free, but expect a lot of cool stuff on both the strongerbyscience.com website in the form of a big article that we're currently working on, but also on the YouTubes, where aside from Dr. Eric Helms' featured videos, we're also shooting a bunch of stuff featuring one another. That aside, I think it's time to plug stuff, and this is my 3rd or 4th time doing this. I think this will also be the best time, so let's get it. If you're enjoying the show, please like, rate, subscribe, and tell your friends. It really helps us out. It really does. And don't forget to check out the YouTube channel. This is where a lot of stuff will be coming out in the next few months to a year, and we're doing our best to level it up as far as providing you with easy to follow content that is not 2 to 4 hours long like this podcast. However, the podcast is here for those that love the deep dive. If you're interested in hiring a virtual coach to help you with your training and or nutrition, Stronger by Science has a team of excellent coaches that can help you. Head over to strongerbyScience.com/coaching. A bunch of updates happening behind the scenes, new sheets for all the coaches to use, a lot of processes being improved, things being streamlined. But regardless of that, SBS Coaching has the reputation that it has for a reason, solid coaching team, and arguably, in our opinion, although somewhat biased, the best out there. If you want to purchase supplements from a reliable source and support the podcast at the same time, try bulksupplements.com using the code SBSPOD for a 5% discount. Stronger by Science wouldn't be Stronger by Science without its community, and we highly recommend that you join the Facebook group and the subreddit, where both myself and Milo are active participants, at least as much as we can, but we are definitely lurking and replying to stuff, as well as participating in topics that are of interest or of that match our expertise at least. Also, check out the newsletter. So the Stronger by Science newsletter, which you can find at strongerbyScience.com/newsletter. High quality, informative content, no spamming, no ads, no BS. That's something that Milo and I are handling, at least to a great extent. An easy way to keep up with research and all things muscle growth, strength, and nutrition related that may be of interest to you. Sign up. Definitely recommended. And last but not least, if you have any questions that you want us to answer, aside from replying to the threads that we post on the Facebook and subreddit communities, you can also send us a voice note at podcast@strongerbyScience.com. And you never know, we may be answering your question. I think that's it as far as plugs. I brought my A game. This is me done for the episode. Milo, have fun, and I'll see you guys next time.
Peace. All right, getting into the actual subject matter. Before we go into how to make training more time efficient, I think we need to briefly outline why time efficiency is even important in the first place. Because one common rebuttal that I already hear happening in the comments is, nah, that ain't me. I don't have time constraints in the gym. I like being in the gym for 3-4 hours or what have you. And to an extent, you have a point. If you truly don't mind spending 15-20 hours in the gym a week, more sometimes, then you probably don't need to worry about time efficiency too much anymore. Obviously, if you do one set per 3 hours, you might have a problem. For most people, around 15 to 20 hours in the gym a week, you probably don't need to worry too much about time efficiency anymore. But for basically everyone else, and believe it or not, most people don't have 15 or 20 hours in the gym per week, time efficiency becomes a concern for a few reasons. One, for people who have really just not that much time, I'm talking an hour, 2, 3, 4 per week in the gym, you do really need to consider what is going to give you the best bang for your buck. You only have so much time, you need to make it count. 1 to 4 hours in the gym, for example, may very likely not be enough to maximize hypertrophy. And so you have to come up with a combination of approaches, variables, etc., that will at least make the most of what you have. You probably still won't get your best gains, but you can get at least very solid gains if you consider how to make your training more time efficient. But what people may not be as aware of is that even people with like 4 or 5 hours in the gym, or 6 even people with increasing amounts of time to spend in the gym, should probably still be concerned with time efficiency. For one, there is the obvious example of opportunity cost. So if you make your training more time efficient, and instead of spending, say, 7 hours in the gym per week, you're now spending 4, all of a sudden, you've freed up 3 hours that you could spend on something else. And while for some people, that may not be a pro, because they enjoy training that much, for other people, that can mean more time with loved ones, other hobbies, etc., etc. But additionally, for hypertrophy specifically, emerging evidence, we're aware of some evidence behind the scenes that is going to be pre-printed relatively soon, and we're also read up on the research that's been published, for example, a meta-analysis by Basval and colleagues from 2022, more volume tends to predictably yield more hypertrophy. There are still some questions to be asked around extreme volumes, like in excess of 20 or 30 sets per week per muscle. But for the most part, doing more sets in a given week for a given muscle will cause more muscle growth. If you only have 2 to 5 hours a week, you may only be able to get 10 sets a week per muscle, or 15, if you don't consider how to be time efficient. Time efficient training modalities can allow you to get more sets in throughout your training week and see more hypertrophy. Or it can allow you to save time, or both. So even if you're someone who has a decent amount of time to train in the gym, you probably do still benefit from making your training more time efficient in that it allows you to do more volume and therefore oftentimes see more hypertrophy. So even if you don't currently identify as someone who's time constrained and that is impacting your training, it very well might still be impacting your training and your progress. So I would highly encourage you to sort of stick around throughout the episode to hear us out on tips to make training time efficient. Pak, anything else on that note?
I just wanted to add that we will obviously touch on strength to a certain extent and mention how things can be more time efficient there. But given the relationship between volume and strength being different to that of volume and hypertrophy, things become not necessarily more manageable there because there are other variables that you need to take in consideration, like rest. However, we will be focusing the bulk of the episode on hypertrophy specifically, given that you have to be a bit more methodical with how you approach things, and you can be a bit more flexible with how you manipulate certain variables. If you want to maximize strength training, there are certain things that are somewhat non-negotiable, but when it comes to hypertrophy, things may not be as clear-cut as some people may assume, and you can still be looking at very close to optimal gains with very little time spent in the gym. That's what I wanted to add there, because I think there's a lot of people here that will be expecting to hear a ton about strength training specifically, and maybe things like powerlifting. But we'll briefly touch on that as well, and little tips that you can implement in order to make that type of training time efficient as well.
Yeah, and as Pak has pointed out previously in his work on minimum effective dose, for strength, you can often start seeing meaningful improvements in that with just 2 to 5 sets a week per lift, maybe even less than that. And so if you're very time constrained but you're concerned with strength, just realize that even if you're only able to get into the gym for, say, an hour a week and get a few heavy sets for the main lifts you care about in, that will still be enough to promote some strength gains. It probably won't be your best, and in fact your best strength gains might be seen around like 10 to 15 sets per week per lift. Around there is where you'll probably see some of your best strength gains. So for the bench, for example, that might be across the week, 5 to 8 sets of competition bench, 2 to 5 sets of some bench variation, etc., getting up to around 10 to 15 sets. For hypertrophy, on the other hand, your best hypertrophy will very likely be seen somewhere in the vicinity of 10 to 30 weekly sets. So we're talking about substantially more volume. However, just like for strength, you can start seeing some appreciable progress with as few as around 2 to 5 weekly sets for a muscle. So you don't need to do a ton if you're super time constrained to still see some progress. So while we won't be touching on strength a ton throughout this episode, just because the time requirements to optimize strength may not be quite as large as to optimize hypertrophy, it is worth noting that for both hypertrophy and strength, you don't need to do very much to see some improvement, especially if you're super time constrained or you're going through a rough patch in life and you don't have the time to dedicate to more extensive training protocols. Without further ado, Pak, we can go into the individual tips. How can we make training more time efficient? First, I think maybe the two most well-researched and relatively evidence-based quote-unquote techniques to save time would be antagonistic paired supersets and drop sets. We'll touch on antagonistic paired supersets first, because we recently pre-printed a study on that very topic, and that was the third study on this topic. Essentially, the idea of an antagonistic paired superset is to superset 2 exercises that have no muscular overlap, and specifically involve antagonistic motions. For example, supersetting a bench press with a row, and supersetting a dumbbell curl with a tricep pushdown. In these exercises, you're essentially performing the opposing joint functions, meaning that you're guaranteed to have no muscular overlap. And in fact, some acute research suggests that by using these antagonistic paired supersets, you're typically looking at worst, no detriment to performance, like you're performing the same whether you're supersetting these two exercises or whether you're not. And at best, maybe a slight improvement in performance. This might have to do with reciprocal inhibition, wherein especially if you're relatively untrained, when you're benching, for example, your back might co-contract, resisting the bench press motion, making it a bit harder for your pecs and triceps, etc., to perform the motion. If instead you performed a set of rows right before you did your bench press, your back would be more fatigued and your body, quote unquote, instinctively would know not to co-contract the back quite as much and resist the bench press motion. But at the very worst, in general, we see similar or slightly better performance from performing antagonistic paired supersets versus just doing traditional straight sets. So that's the good news acutely. But the even better news is that we now have 3 studies, including the recently pre-printed one by Burke and colleagues, on antagonistic paired supersets versus traditional training on muscle hypertrophy. And to make a long story short, across these 3 studies, 2 of which were performed in relatively untrained populations by Pringa and colleagues and by Fink and colleagues, I believe the study by Fink and colleagues looked at a superset of the leg extension and leg curl, and the study by Pringa and colleagues looked at a superset of the banded curl and banded tricep extension. In both of these studies, we observed similar hypertrophy, whether using supersets or just traditional training. Similarly, in this most recent study by Burke and colleagues, we actually looked at trained lifters in the context of a full body program. So specifically, if memory serves, we're looking at Smith machine bench press, lat pull down, cable push down, dumbbell curl, leg curl, and leg extension. So we're looking at 6 exercises total, and either participants in the traditional group perform these exercises one after the other, with traditional rest intervals between each set, versus in the superset group, they went back and forth between 2 exercises in any given pair. So supersetting the pull down with the Smith machine bench, supersetting the dumbbell curl with the cable push down, and supersetting the leg extension with the leg curl. And in these trained lifters who on average had around 3.5 years of training experience, we observed similar hypertrophy, whether using a superset approach or using a traditional approach. So overall, both the acute evidence and the longitudinal evidence on antagonistic paired supersets is quite favorable when it comes to saying, hey, you can likely see similar muscle growth, but oftentimes cutting down training time by 30 to 50%, which is a really substantial decrease in workout time, because either you just got out the gym 30 to 50% faster, or you now have cleared up 30 to 50% of your session to do more sets. And as we established earlier, doing more sets to a relatively high level of 10 to 30, potentially plus sets per week per muscle group is going to yield more hypertrophy. So for someone who's got, say, 2 hours a week to train, that could be increasing your volume per week by about 40% if you spend the same amount of time training, but simply performed supersets, and that allowed you to do more sets in a given training week. A couple of caveats to the recent findings by Burke and colleagues that we demonstrated similar hypertrophy in trained lifters using supersets versus traditional sets. One is that at least initially, when lifters first performed a superset session versus just a traditional session, they did report slightly higher exertion. So session RP rating was about 1 point higher, around 7 out of 10 for the traditional session versus around 8 out of 10 for the superset session. So at least initially, when you're first incorporating this technique, if you've never done it before, you may find that it is a bit more challenging even for the same number of sets. And this makes sense because training density is increasing. You're doing the same number of sets but in less time, so you're doing more work but in the same amount of time in the end. The second caveat would be that the reports of nausea, so just in general feeling nauseated, were around twice as high, if memory serves correctly, in the superset group compared to the traditional group. Notably, we only asked for this at the end of the study, so this was entirely recall-based as opposed to being something we assessed throughout the study, so there is some doubt around whether or not this was a super solid measurement, but it is worth noting that you might experience a bit more nausea. To circumvent this issue, what I would recommend doing is taking slightly longer rest intervals, essentially decreasing the work density or training density slightly by taking longer rest intervals. or simply starting out with fewer sets to begin with. Both of these would functionally lower training density, and I think help out initially with reducing or limiting amounts of nausea experienced.
Mm-hmm.
The final caveat I was going to give was, while session RP was initially higher in the superset group, in the superset workout versus the traditional workout, this difference, when averaged across the study, like essentially just asking people in the superset group, how difficult was your session on a session RP scale? And people in the traditional group, the same question. When you average those ratings in both groups across the whole study, across the, I believe, 8 weeks duration, their ratings were actually very similar. So even though in the first session, when first exposed to a superset session, it seemed more challenging, in the long term, there's a good chance that mostly goes away. You're still training with a higher training density, so I would expect it to be a bit more challenging, but it doesn't seem to be a huge or meaningful limitation of the superset technique. So broadly speaking, I think those are the findings from the superset data. Pak, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one extra caveat that in the study itself, the volume prescription was not would not be deemed high or extremely high. So as it stands, with the current available literature on supersets, there is a small asterisk close to next to supersets and their effectiveness or how appropriate they would be in very high volume training range as supersets. In my opinion, there's nothing to indicate that they wouldn't be as effective, or you'd get more nausea, or they wouldn't be as manageable. However, it's worth noting. But more interestingly, in the Burke et al., excuse the first author name, shout out Ryan Burke. In the Burke et al. Study, strength was also assessed via Smith machine bench press 1RM test, and that was also not different between groups. Also, power and endurance were assessed, and there was no difference there. And in addition to no differences in hypertrophy being observed, for whatever is worth, there were also no differences in body composition assessed. A common issue that is often brought up for supersets, and a common, not misunderstanding, but misconception of supersets and some of the limitations around them that I've seen from quite a few people when that data was made public, is that supersets are great only if you either have a private gym or you go to the gym at hours where the gym is empty, because in order to do supersets, you need access to multiple pieces of equipment and it's impractical. And you end up having to hog different machines, and in practicality, they're not a technique or a method that you can really utilize if you're just in a commercial gym during busy hours. However, I think that that's a bit of a myth, and if you are somewhat organized with your exercise selection and how you approach and implement supersets in your training, there are many ways that you can incorporate supersets without having to hog two different pieces of equipment. And a couple of ways to do that are the following. One, you can opt for a machine, and for a machine-based exercise and then a dumbbell-based exercise. For example, chest press machine and bend over dumbbell rows, or a lat pull down machine and a dumbbell chest press, and so on and so forth. And essentially combine two exercises that you can do in the same sort of vicinity, where you grab a pair of dumbbells, you go to the lat pull down, you do your lat pull down, you do some push-ups, you do some standing shoulder press, whatever you like, some form of agonist antagonist superset. But there are many other ways that you can make supersets happen even in a very crowded and busy environment. For example, using a cable pulley machine, where you can do cable chest press and cable rows, and that would only require you to be on the same machine and just adjust the height of the cable pulley. Same goes with a bunch of different exercises. So yes, the traditional idea of supersets being things like, the barbell bench press and then a bend over barbell row, although that's still possible if you really want to make it happen. If you find that you are in very busy environments and equipment availability is limited, as long as you do your due diligence before and plan ahead, you can incorporate supersets in great ways. A very cool superset that we did for some time was dumbbell pullovers and dumbbell chest press. But there's many different combinations. Just do not nocebo yourself necessarily and tell yourself that, yeah, supersets would be great, but I don't think I can implement them because I work out at a commercial gym. It's likely that if you make some slight adjustments to your training, and I'm sure Milo can add a few examples here as well, supersets become a very easily implementable time efficiency strategy.
Fully agreed. And I'll give a few more examples of supersets I commonly use in my training. But I think ultimately, if you think through your array of different exercises you can use for a given muscle, you'll almost always find one piece of equipment that matches up. Let's say, for example, you're training chest and back in the same session. Okay, you can train your chest with a barbell. You can train it with a Smith machine. You can train it with dumbbells. You can train it with machines. You can train it with cables. You can even train it with body weight. As long as you consider which modality an exercise has, and you think about, whoa, this is quirky Zoom, for our viewers. As long as you consider what modality one exercise is using, you can almost always find a modality and an exercise that matches with that one. So for example, if you're doing a push-up for your chest, or a deficit push-up, you could do a pull-up. And as long as you're doing it in the same vicinity, that can be an easy superset. If you're doing a Smith machine bench press, you could find a pair of dumbbells and do some dumbbell bent over rows. Certain exercises are also just more flexible, like grabbing a pair of dumbbells for dumbbell bent over rows. That means you can superset that back exercise with nearly anything else. All you need to keep hold of is that one pair of dumbbells. So you can make it work, I would say like 70, 80% of the time. There's going to be cases where the gym is so hectic and so busy, you're not able to grab the equipment. There's going to be cases where you want a very specific exercise, and then it's not going to be feasible. But I think for 70, 80% of the time, there is a way to superset a couple exercises. And the important thing is, before I give some more specific examples, the superset probably doesn't need to be antagonistic. It can probably just be non-overlapping as well. Now, there is less research around this as it relates to hypertrophy, so I'd be a bit more cautious in being super confident in the findings here. But I think that as long as there is no muscular overlap, for example, like calf raise and a lateral raise, and neither exercise tires you out too much, like for example a squat would or a deadlift would, there's a good chance you can superset them to good effect. As a good heuristic, if performance doesn't suffer on either exercise involved, personally, at this point, I'm comfortable saying you can superset them with likely no detriment to hypertrophy. It's a relatively hot take, but I do think that allows you to superset many different exercises that obviously aren't squats or deadlifts typically. But many different exercises can be supersetted, and typically when I'm trying to make a session time efficient, I will superset 60 to 80% of my exercises. Some exercises don't lend themselves to it, but most exercises do in some capacity. A few examples, as I mentioned, I typically superset pretty much all ab and calf work to get the evil work out of the way, 2 birds, 1 stone sort of thing. I superset any bicep tricep work pretty much. I frequently superset any chest and back work. I frequently superset any quad isolation and hamstring isolation work, like a leg extension and leg curl. I frequently superset any hip abduction and adduction work I do, like a machine hip abduction and machine hip adduction work. So yeah, there's a wide variety of things you could superset. You could even superset something like a shrug and a wrist curl if you wanted to, provided you used straps on the shrug. There's a wide variety of things you can superset, and instead of me prescribing you use these exercises specifically, I'm just going to tell you, if performance doesn't suffer on either exercise, it's a good sign you can superset them and save time with likely no detriment to hypertrophy. That is my hunch there. So yeah, those are paired supersets / non-overlapping supersets.
In terms of those who are mostly interested in strength training, if you have the main movements that you're training specifically for strength, you could use agonist, antagonist supersets to get in some of your hypertrophy work if you're doing your hypertrophy work. The same goes with some powerlifters. But again, for strength training specifically, it is likely that you can just be very time efficient simply by opting for a bit less volume. But still, if you have other movements that you want to include in your training, let's say you're doing a bench workout, your bench is your strength movement, but you also have some accessory back work, it's likely that it would not affect your bench strength training sets a lot if you were to superset that bench press with some lat pull down. Terms and conditions apply. If you're a world champion powerlifter, you probably need to have enough time available to optimize. But for the majority of individuals, that would be totally fine, and you'd still be looking at awesome strength gains there as well.
Agreed. And I've had powerlifting clients do this before, and with essentially no detriment to performance, so that's been good. I do think generally I'd reserve this more for accessory movements, so not for the main competition lifts, specifically the bench, because I think supersetting the squat with anything else or the deadlift with anything else can be a bit tricky. But yeah, I think it can certainly work as far as even just preserving performance and load on the bar. Cool. Next up, we have drop sets. As I mentioned earlier, I think this is probably the second most, or even the first most evidence-based technique, quote-unquote, for saving time. And just to summarize what a drop set is first, before we go into the evidence, a drop set is when you perform one set relatively close to failure or true failure, and then the protocol I would use is perform a 20% load drop and immediately perform another set. Repeat this process for as many drop sets as you want to do. Typically, I cap it around 3 to 4, I would say, at the most, just because at that point, the load you're using becomes so light that I couldn't tell you for sure that we're observing the same marginal hypertrophy for each additional drop set as we were before. Like once you've done 3 to 4 20% load drops, the load you're using might have dropped from, say, 80% of your max to 20% of your max or something. Keep in mind, it's a 20% load drop from one set relative to the last. So you go from sort of 80% of your max, it's 80 kilograms. Let's say your max is 100 kilograms in a very lucky example. You would drop that down to 64. So a 20% drop. And then from 64, you drop it down to like 52 point whatever it is. So a 20% load drop each set relative to the last. And by the time you do 3 or 4 drops, the load you're using might have become so light that you're no longer optimizing the hypertrophy you get from each additional drop set. Or at least that's a potential concern there. So I would typically cap this around 3 to 4 drop sets for a given exercise. But yeah, essentially, you do one hard set, you drop the load 20%, you do another set, drop the load 20%, do another set until you're done. And we do have a meta-analysis by Coleman and colleagues comparing the effects of drop sets roughly performed in this fashion. The exact protocol can vary, but that is the protocol I would run with as relatively representative of what the evidence has done. We have a meta-analysis comparing studies that have done this to, in these studies, groups that just did traditional training with traditional rest intervals. One caveat to the findings I'm about to say is that in the drop set group, they on average performed around 30% more sets, but that's on a set per set basis. So a drop set would count as one traditional set as well. So for every 10 sets, let's say, the traditional groups in this meta-analysis performed, the drop set groups would perform around 13 sets. However, even with that difference in volume, on average, the drop set groups took between around 50 and 70% less time to train. And the results were similar hypertrophy gains. So you could probably save around 50% of the time with a drop set approach. I'm a bit more skeptical personally, and we can discuss this, about using drop sets exclusively as part of your hypertrophy training routine, just because the drop-off in load being used is quite stark, and I think it can be quite acutely fatiguing. So like going from a drop set earlier into the session for, say, your chest press into like a dumbbell fly later, I'm not sure you'd be able to use that much load anymore, just on account of how fatiguing that was, and you might very quickly drop below that minimum effective intensity, quote unquote, or minimum effective maximally effective intensity. This is complicated. Of around 30% of your max. And like, if you get very fatigued early in the session by doing drop sets for the bulk of your session, I could see that becoming somewhat of an issue. But yeah, certainly on the same level as paired supersets in terms of how much time they can save, and the evidence suggesting that they can result in similar hypertrophy in just much less time. What do you think about drop sets as a main thing?
I think they're a great strategy that you can implement, but there are some practical quote unquote issues with some exercises where you will need somebody there to potentially unload the bar as you're getting into the drop set. The same goes for certain kits of equipment, but a great way, especially on like a cable exercise, or I don't know, if you're doing a dumbbell exercise, running the rack can be fun, but at the same time, in some of the environments that we train in, doing a drop set, for example, on bicep curls may be a bit of a pain sometimes. I think overall a great time efficient strategy that you can even combine with supersets. So supersets on some exercises, drop sets on some other exercises, and before you know it, you're in the gym for half a minute. You've done 35 sets, and you are unaware of how you got in and out of the gym, and now you're questioning if you were even in the gym in the first place. But yeah, joking aside, something that we've started to implement a bit more, and something you've been a proponent of, and I've started to use more in my training. What would you say for those that would critique the fatigue from each drop set and how that can impact hypertrophy? I've heard things about drop sets not being great, or with some mechanistic mumbo jumbo being thrown, which does not seem to be supported by the evidence. But what would you say, Dr. Wolf?
Yeah, I think this falls in the category of things people say about a technique without realizing that if this were such a big issue, that would also show up in the applied outcomes. So if the excessive fatigue caused by drop sets, for example, were to be problematic in the context of hypertrophy training, let's say mediated by the excessive fatigue caused, that would show up in the context of these studies in that the drop set group would experience less hypertrophy. So at the very least, what we can say is, one, there's insufficient evidence to make that claim, and two, if there is such an effect, it isn't big enough to show up in these studies. Or at least it isn't big enough to mediate a reduction in hypertrophy in these studies comparing drop sets and traditional training. I do think there is something to probably not overusing drop sets in your training. Like, I think you can definitely use them to good effect, but I think if your whole session is just drop sets, maybe we start seeing that with how dense your training becomes in terms of just how many sets you're doing back to back, how many exposures close to failure you're doing very quickly, by a couple exercises in for a given muscle, you may not be maximizing stimulus per set anymore. But yeah, I think it's a silly argument when you consider that the actual outcome of interest is still the same, whether you're using drop sets or traditional sets. So you're almost defeating your own argument. Or at the very least, you're just pointing out that there is absence of evidence in the context that you're interested in, which is fine, but probably I think that criticism is made too frequently rather than not frequently enough.
Yeah, and some when hearing about drop sets, some often resort to comparing them with myo reps. What do we think about those? So that's a training technique that has gone quite a bit of not hype in a negative way, but it's been used more and more in certain circles and promoted by certain people in our field. How would you say myo reps differ to drop sets, and what do we know?
Sure. I don't think there's personally, and this is something I've somewhat changed my mind on recently, but I don't think there's a huge difference between the two. It's just that I think we have more direct evidence on drop sets versus myo reps. And I think the use of myo reps has far exceeded the use of drop sets, for example, which I think it should be the other way around almost. Like, we have reasonably okay research on drop sets and consistently see similar hypertrophy, even with only 30% more volume, or sets rather. So myo reps, to my knowledge, we only have one direct study testing the actual concept. And I don't think it's been published yet. I could be wrong. You can correct me on this. I'm not sure I've seen it published. We have studies on rest pause-like techniques, and they're generally relatively underwhelming. Like, as in, you see similar hypertrophy, but it's a bit less consistent. There's a bit less data, to my knowledge, than drop sets. So I think it's a totally fine alternative. It's just that I would typically opt for drop sets over myo reps, just on account of there being more evidence on them. I'm also a bit skeptical of the rationale for myo reps. where it's all about essentially when you end the set, you're close to failure, all of your motor units and largest muscle fibers, the faster twitch muscle fibers, are recruited and activated and thus being stimulated. And so if you only take 15 to 30 seconds rest and you do another set of like 3 to 5 reps, all of those reps are perfectly effective. It essentially comes back down to the effective reps model. And I'm a bit skeptical of that, at least in its most fundamentalist or strictest sense. So yeah, my reps are fine. You can incorporate them if you like. I think drop sets are usually the better way to go.
That covers me. And yeah, the study, so there's an unofficial study that was unofficial. I'm not sure if publishing it.
Unpublished?
Unpublished, yeah. It was just referred to as on a couple of websites as unofficial. It still hasn't been published. It was presented at a conference, and the actual title of it at that conference was Muscular Adaptations Following 8 Weeks of a MyoRep Set Configuration versus Traditional Straight Sets in Resistance Trained Individuals, and the muscle thickness that was measured via ultrasound was the same between MyoReps and straight sets, despite big differences in volume. So somewhat similar outcomes to what we see with drop sets. MyoReps sounds cooler though, so I'm gonna be doing those and not your BS drop set propaganda.
On a serious note, I think one cool use case for drop sets is as a last set. So I think this is especially relevant for people who have like some time to train in the gym, but want to cram more training in. And I think that's especially relevant for people training for hypertrophy who are trying to get more volume in and make more of the time in the gym, is to essentially just treat the last set of most exercises, especially later exercises into a session where the fatigue incurred by drop sets might not be an issue, is to use the last set as a drop set. So essentially you're planning to do 3 sets of normal pressing, or let's say chest pressing for ease of illustration's sake. Let's say you did 3 sets. You would do 2 sets, and then for your last set, instead of just doing your 3rd set and calling it quits, you would do, say, 2 to 3, maybe even 4 20% load drops, and just immediately do another set. And that can be a really easy way to get, like, effectively, maybe an additional 3 sets of volume in. You know, like if you're doing 4 load drops, for example, that might be 5 drop sets, quote unquote, which might be the equivalent of like 3 to 4-ish normal straight sets. But instead of spending an additional 10, 12 minutes or whatever it is on the chest press machine to get those additional 4 sets-ish, you might be spending an additional 2 minutes on there. So it can be a very nice bang for your buck option on many exercises that lend themselves to it. And they can even be combined with antagonistic paired supersets, where you do that for a last set of a superset. So you do, say, machine rows and machine chest press, and for the last set of each, you do a drop set. And I think that can be a good option for time efficiency's sake. Anything else to add on drop sets?
Nope. Yeah, that was perfect.
Beautiful. Next up, we have slightly moderating rest times. So we've spoken about this before on the pod, I think, but there's been a recent preprint by Singer and colleagues we were involved in. We're also authors on that preprint on the effects of rest times on hypertrophy. And essentially, looking at all of the available evidence on training with different rest times, measuring muscle hypertrophy, we found that around 1 to 2 minutes of rest might be sufficient to maximize the muscle hypertrophy response. There's a number of questions remaining, but that is one of the, I would say, the biggest takeaway. And so especially for hypertrophy training, this is different for strength, I think, because for strength you might be more concerned with maximizing load on the bar as a means to increase specificity. But for hypertrophy, just resting for 1 to 2 minutes between sets might allow you to get more total sets in and get more total stimulus in a given session, especially if you're someone with time constraints. And I think this can be especially helpful for people who are under the impression that they need to rest for 3, 4, 5, 6 minutes between sets for hypertrophy to not make it quote-unquote junk volume. If anything, even the rest time between, even rest times of less than 1 minute seemed to lead to appreciable hypertrophy in that analysis. It seemed to be less than 1 to 2 minutes, but it wasn't as though those sets were totally ineffective. So I think 1 to 2 minutes is going to be a relatively big time saver for many, and something they may not be aware of in their pursuit of hypertrophy. Next, we have training to failure. And should you train to failure? How close to failure should you train if you're pressed for time? I think at this point we have the general understanding that on a set per set basis, you're just looking at one set. If you wanted to maximize how much muscle growth that one set caused, someone had a gun to your head and said, look, if you don't maximize the growth from this set you're about to do, it's goodbye. Should you train to failure? How close to failure should you train? The answer to that is probably to failure, at least according to a meta-regression by Robinson and colleagues from last year, which basically showed that the closer a set is taken to failure, the more hypertrophy you see. Now, because hypertrophy is sort of a multivariate outcome, wherein it isn't just proximity to failure that can influence it, but the combination of volume, proximity to failure, potentially even frequency and other things can influence the hypertrophy response, and their interaction can influence it. It's not as though we have all the answers, but at least on a set per set basis, it seems like going closer to failure probably causes at least a bit more hypertrophy. And so, for someone who was pressed for time, you probably do want to take every set pretty close to failure or even to failure, depending on just how little time you have. But additionally, there is some evidence, in my view, not much, but there is some, in favor of forced reps or going past failure for hypertrophy. Specifically, there's a few different ways you could look at it. One is you could view drop sets as a form of past failure training, in that instead of altering technique to get more reps after failure, you're essentially dropping the load. But oftentimes, modifications in technique, such as involving your hips more or like bouncing the weight up or what have you, those really just involve a reduction in the force production requirement of the primary muscle group involved. Like for example, in the curl, for example, the biceps. And so that is essentially the same as dropping the load. Both involve your biceps needing to produce less force to complete another repetition. And in the drop set data, we see that doing 13 really low rest interval sets is about the equivalent of 10 traditional sets. So at the very least, it seems like going past failure offers a bit of additional benefit, potentially, based on the drop set research. Similarly, this study by Larson and colleagues that we recently preprinted was comparing just doing 4 range of motion calf raises to doing 4 range of motion calf raises, but then doing lengthened partials after failure as a means to get forced reps in. Indeed. It's a muscle and feels episode. We're going back on the lengthened train. It's hard to tell whether the additional hypertrophy I'm about to describe was as a result of doing forced reps or whether it was the additional lengthened training. My hunch is that it's both. As I mentioned, as you go closer to failure, you generally see more hypertrophy, and there is a pretty compelling body of evidence at this point suggesting that lengthened training is better for hypertrophy than shortened training. So I think both are ultimately at play, but the group, or rather the condition, because it was within participant design, the leg that trained with lengthened partials after failure, doing those forced reps, saw about 40% more growth, actually. So even just for the same number of sets, doing forced reps after failure, at least based on this one study, might be beneficial for hypertrophy. It could be the fact that they were lengthened partials, so my personal way of implementing that would be, once you've reached full range of motion failure, bust out some lengthened partials until you can't do another partial. That would be a good way to go about it. But at the very least, I think that if you have really limited time in the gym, forced reps, specifically lengthened supersets, doing lengthened partials after failure, might be something to try. It probably doesn't hurt. Pak?
So I wanted to touch on and ask something that is related, obviously, to what you just said, but not so much time-efficient training, but rather training to failure and that changing in the next couple of years based on findings like the one by Steen et al., where going beyond traditionally defined failure and going into lengthened failure, as we're doing in the study that we're running in NYC at the moment. Do we think that the current definition of training to task failure, task being usually full ROM failure, may actually change in the next few years? It's a parenthesis. I know we don't have Greg here to go down certain rabbit holes, but I gotta fill in that gap somewhat. So it's a chat that I'd love to have with you on air.
Oh man. So I think for hypertrophy's sake, you would essentially be shifting the goalpost of failure from full range of motion failure, which for many movements like a calf raise, like a pull down, like a pull up, like a row, is in the shortened position, to failure occurring when you can't get another lengthened partial. And depending on how the evidence pans out over the next few years, there is a chance that will be warranted. Like, let's say, Pak, you did a set of barbell rows to full range of motion failure with straight technique. By the time you weren't able to touch the bar to your stomach or chest anymore, would that set have felt particularly challenging? Probably not really, right? Like, you kind of just aren't able to touch your stomach anymore and the set is over, right?
The set, if I use the stomach, the set's over at rep 1. It's like, yep.
Yep. So I think for many movements that are really short and biased and that the resistance is quote unquote the challenge is greatest in the very shortened position, you can often get a lot more lengthened partials or partial repetitions that are a bit more stretched after failure. And depending on how the evidence pans out over the next few years, with this study by Larson and colleagues I mentioned on the calf raise being their first look at this, that may or may not be warranted. I think certainly it's a more palatable way of incorporating lengthen training that most people are more receptive to. Like, if you tell someone to do just lengthen partials based on the evidence, they may not be super amenable to it because it's like, it looks weird. I don't know. I'm not sure I'm going to get gym cred for this one. Whereas if you do partials after failure, that sounds a lot more hardcore and is a lot cooler, you know? So depending on how the evidence pans out over the next few years, perhaps.
Yeah. For time efficiency training specifically, if you're somebody interested in hypertrophy, I think there's very little downsides to not going past sort of full range of motion failure and reaching the point where you cannot perform reps at long muscle lengths and at the point where you cannot do partials at long muscle lengths. I think that for the majority of people, at least for most exercises that you can do so in effectively and safely, the latter being maybe a bit more important, I think that that's a great way to at least tell yourself that, hey, we got everything we could potentially get from this set. Is it possible that you didn't get a whole lot more by doing those 3 to 4 extra reps past the full range of motion failure? Sure. But if you're pressed for time and you want to get the most bang for your buck stimulus, I don't think there are many concerns there. Again, as long as you're being somewhat methodical about your exercise selection and where you implement this, I don't think there's a lot of concerns as far as fatigue goes and other words that are often thrown to sort of counter that sort of approach or training to failure in general. But the one thing I recommend to most clients who are pressed for time, especially if we are doing slightly less volume, even when trying to incorporate drop sets and supersets, treating some movements or at least some sets in this manner, I think is a safe way to make sure that you're getting absolutely the most bang for your buck as far as hypertrophy stimulus goes.
Yeah. And I think we can have a whole discussion, not necessarily now, but in the future, as more evidence comes out, around whether or not going to failure too frequently or too early into a session specifically can be detrimental for hypertrophy. The recent publication of a study by Rafalo and colleagues on this has spurred some discussion around, essentially they compared going to failure in all sets for the leg press and leg extension to staying a bit more submaximal, around 1 to 2 reps in reserve for all sets on the leg press and leg extension. And essentially they found better hypertrophy, or maybe slightly better hypertrophy of the muscles primarily being stimulated by a leg extension when staying a bit more submaximal throughout the session. So essentially, by staying a bit farther from failure throughout the session and being a bit fresher by the time they go to leg extensions, they were able to stimulate more growth from the leg extension, potentially. This was a very small difference. I'm not sure it's worth reading into a ton, but as a general heuristic, I think that there might be, for people who have the time, a point to staying a bit farther from failure earlier into a session for hypertrophy and going a bit closer to failure later into a session for hypertrophy, just to guard against this potential effect with no meaningful downside. But for people who are really pressed for time, at this point, I would still take every set very close to failure or even to failure, pretty much always. So that brings me to another tip, since we're already on lengthened supersets, which is one of the few things that seem to reliably increase hypertrophy at this point across across different comparisons, like whether we're talking a comparison of lengthened partials versus shortened partials, or lengthened isometrics versus shortened isometrics, one of the only things that seems to reliably cause more hypertrophy with no additional time commitment is focusing on the stretch. So whether it's the lengthened partials, whether it's through aiming for a fuller range of motion, if you're currently not training with a full enough range of motion, missing out on that stretch, focusing more on the stretch will probably get you more growth with no additional time commitment to speak of. So it's unclear exactly how much more growth that would be, but if it doesn't take any additional time and you're constrained by time, it seems like a no-brainer to just focus on the stretch a bit more, get a bit more growth without spending any more time in the gym.
Yeah,
all right.
Hit me. I don't see many scenarios where skipping on the stretch, unless you feel, I don't know, you have some injury or some exercise feel extremely uncomfortable or whatever. But even then, you can mitigate by choosing different exercises. I don't think there are many scenarios where skipping on that stretch makes sense, or at least not emphasizing it. We're literally talking about an extra half a second or second. It is not really a big deal. You do not need to go to the maximum possible stretch that feels super uncomfortable and do a deficit push-up off of 7 plates to the point where your shoulders hurt. But yeah, that focus on the stretch, I think, should be a default regardless of whether you're trying to be time efficient or not. But when you're time efficient, when you're trying to be as time efficient as possible, ensuring that that's there makes even more sense.
For sure. All right. Next up, we have compound movements. This is a relatively no-brainer, and I think this has been preached to no end even when you're a beginner getting into fitness. But compound movements should form the basis of your training plan, just because they allow you to train a variety of muscles at least reasonably well at once. So let's say, for example, you're doing a lat pull down, right? We have evidence suggesting, as we've previously discussed on the back episode on the podcast, that pull downs are actually a decent bicep exercise. There is only one study on this, but at least it's some evidence in favor of that being true. Equally, pull downs also train your lats, your teres major, your delts, some of your upper back musculature, even your grip. So we're training a lot of muscles at once, maybe like 5-6 muscles at once, at least reasonably well. If you want to replace that with isolation movements, you would need to do a lot of different isolation movements to get the sum of its parts, right? So, compound movements as the foundation of your training, and as a rule of thumb, the more time constrained you are, the higher the proportion of compound movements from your training should be, and the lower the proportion of isolation movements. There's going to be times where you might want to incorporate more isolation movements, as they can essentially allow you to increase the likelihood of the target muscle being the limiting factor. If you're doing something like a pull down, theoretically, there is a chance that your biceps go at first and you're no longer able to produce enough elbow flexion torque to complete the lift. But if you're doing something like a pullover, for example, to isolate your lats, you have less of a chance of that being the case, just because it's primarily shoulder extension occurring. So there's going to be a time when you want to include more isolation work, but when you're time constrained, probably isn't one of them. Pak?
Yeah, for sure. And just to give an example, so you could be doing a superset with an incline dumbbell press and bend over dumbbell rows. In that superset, you are hitting your chest, your triceps, your front delts, your rear delts, your lats, mid-back, biceps, and obviously not all those muscle groups will get the same stimulus, but they're all going to get a pretty good stimulus as far as hypertrophy goes, assuming you are going to failure or very, very close to failure. If you're time pressed, doing that versus doing, for example, chest flies and then maybe an isolation exercise for your lats, which obviously would still involve some biceps, I think that's that can make a big difference for somebody who is time constrained. But yeah, 100, like, there's this traditional view of compound movements from back in the day as the big 3 or the big 5, and specifically like barbell compound movements, where in reality, any exercise, even if it's a machine exercise or a dumbbell exercise that involves many muscle groups simultaneously, is a compound movement and will be a much better option than trying to include isolation work if you're pressed for time. Sure, you can do that. If you have those extra minutes at the end of your session, you can always have like an empty slot on your program where you're like, cool, if I have time, I'll also do some bicep curls. But if you've already done 3 pressing and 3 pulling exercises, it's likely that your triceps and your biceps, as well as other muscle groups, are getting a ton of stimulus without you just having to focus on them and then missing out on other muscle groups.
Yep, fully agreed. The next tip we have for the listeners is minimizing warm-up time. So people with a strength background, I think, are typically the ones most culpable or guilty of this, in that they might spend a bit more time warming up than is strictly required. And specifically with warm-up time, it is for hypertrophy specifically now. It is mostly a sunk cost. There's going to be cases where it isn't. If, for example, you have an injury and you find that you need more time to be pain-free or what have you. But as far as directly stimulating muscle hypertrophy, warming up doesn't do much, if any, of that. The work is simply too submaximal to really stimulate hypertrophy maximally, right? Similarly, the research around what the best warm-up protocol is, as I think Pak recently did some content on that's being published on the Strong by Science YouTube channel, so go check that out, is remarkably simple and should be pretty quick. The evidence around warming up, like one of the studies that I'm thinking of, they compared doing a set of, just a set at 40% of your max with around 8 reps to just a set with 80% of your max for 8 reps, I think. Of working weight, not of your max, to using both. And doing both was a bit better than doing just a set of 40% of your working weight or just 80% of your working weight. But just doing a set of 80% of your working weight already gave you most of the benefit. And that's in the absence of any other major warm-up from what I can recall. Pak, you can speak more to this, but from what I understand, a warm-up for hypertrophy does not need to be extensive, especially if you've already done some exercises for that body part in the session. You may not even need more than like one quick set to feel out the weight, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. So when it comes to the current literature, yes, for 1 repetition maximum strength testing specifically, because it is not like we have longitudinal data specifically on whether different warm-ups will lead to more favorable strength outcomes over a long period of time. But yeah, if you're going for a 1 RM for whatever reason, doing a specific warm-up and gradually increasing the load until you're ready to do your test makes sense. But for hypertrophy specifically, it is likely that just a feel set, or whatever you want to call it, where you sit down on a chest press machine, use a light load and do a few reps with that and then jump straight into your set, it is likely that that will be more than enough for you to maximize hypertrophy adaptations in the long term. And I would go as far as to say that for many of you, and obviously that depends on the exercise, if you're doing a machine exercise, you could even jump straight into your working set. I wouldn't recommend it, and spending the extra 20 seconds is not a big deal. But if we're talking theoreticals here, I don't think there would be a big issue or a big increase in injury risk. Obviously, if you're doing a bench press, if you're doing an exercise that has some form of skill component, doing a couple more warm-ups may make some sense. But again, if you're pressed for time and you've designed your session, which we will get to it in a second, and you've designed your session in a way that makes sense from a time efficiency perspective, and your exercise selection is on point, you will likely be fine by spending very little time on warm-ups. And yeah, overall warm-ups for hypertrophy, I think, are somewhat overrated. I wouldn't recommend doing a bunch of prehab and whatever exercises unless you're specifically instructed to by whatever, a healthcare professional or anything of that sort. Get in the gym, feel the first exercise, and if the next exercise that you're doing is targeting a similar muscle group, you don't need to do much. If you go from a chest exercise to a back exercise, again, 1 or 2 light sets at the beginning with minimal rest in between, and you're ready to rock for your first set.
Beautiful. I think our last 3 tips that we really have are going to be around hypertrophy, specifically around exercise order. I would say there's like 3 heuristics I follow. So obviously we have made some content previously on how to best order exercises for progress, and that's on the channel, so you can check that out on the YouTube channel. For hypertrophy, it doesn't seem to play a tremendous role, and so I wouldn't be too concerned with what it is. And that brings me to tip number 1, which is be flexible with exercise order. Especially for someone who's busy, and who doesn't have much time to train, there's a good chance you're not always picking when you train, and you might have to pick around rush hour. Regardless, if you have to train in at least a somewhat busy gym, being a bit more flexible with your exercise order, meaning you're not tied to exactly how your session is written out, can allow you to avoid waiting around for 5 or 10 minutes until a piece of equipment frees up. Instead, you can just go do another exercise in the meantime, and for hypertrophy, you'll likely see similar growth. So I think being flexible with your exercise order as far as doing the third exercise in a session instead of the second one, if the second piece of equipment you need is taken, for example. The second tip around exercise order would be to structure the order in a manageable fashion. So personally, for example, if I try and do squats and then any other compound lower body exercise right afterwards, I'm going to be inflating my rest times quite heavily because I'm just out of breath already from the squatting. And if I go into another compound movement, I'm going to get increasingly out of breath to the point where I might feel at least like I need to take relatively long rest times between sets. Whereas if I do a set for, say, I do my squats and then I go into, let's say, a machine chest press, I get to sit down. Life is good. I get to catch my breath a little bit. And then if I have to go back to do some legs after, that's totally fine. I'm not going to be out of breath anymore. And so that can actually cut down on rest times with likely no real downside as far as hypertrophy goes. So being reasonable about your exercise order as far as structuring it in a fashion that makes sense for you and your experience as far as what limits, like reduces workout time, is also good. And then the final tip I have is in the same vein as for drop sets earlier, where I would make the last set of an exercise a drop set, is to do some of your hardest training as far as how out of breath it gets you, as far as how tiring it is right before you leave the gym. If you do it earlier in the session, like if, for example, I do high rep leg press midway through my session, that might get me quite out of breath and fatigued for the rest of the session, which might inflate my rest times for the rest of the session a little bit. However, if I do it right before I leave the gym, if I'm driving home or even if I'm walking home, I can typically cope with being out of breath if I'm outside the gym. It won't have inflated my rest times and therefore inflated my total workout time. And so that can also help with reducing workout time in my experience. Pak, anything else to add as far as hypertrophy training goes?
Not really. You hit the nail on the head.
Beautiful. I think you noted down a few tips for making strength training more manageable. Is that right?
Yes, for sure. We've obviously alluded to a couple of things at the beginning of the episode just because we didn't want the strength enthusiasts to sign off and be like, oh boy, this is another muscle growth episode. However, as Milo alluded to at the beginning, the first tip would be, hey, cut your training volume significantly. The current literature on training volume and strength suggests that even with around 10 sets per lift per week, you may be looking at close to maximum strength gains, and that's not really a ton of volume, but you could go as low as 3 to 6 heavy sets in the 1 to 5 rep range for the lifts that you're trying to get stronger in. Now, the research that we have is specifically in squat, bench, and deadlift with 1RM as the main outcome. So, number one tip, do less training volume. That is going to make things much more manageable as far as time goes. Do your accessories as supersets. That's something that I often see take more time than is needed. If you're a powerlifter or somebody who is power building, do your heavy squat, your single, or whatever, your set of 1 to 5, your one back off set. That can be done if you're methodical about your warm-ups and you're not just socializing in the gym or taking a lot of time just between sets. Doing your accessories as warm-ups following your heavy set can make your session much more time efficient. Resting less in certain strength movements is also a good way to further minimize the time in the gym. Now, I'm not saying rest 30 seconds between a heavy set of squats, but instead of resting for 5 minutes, rest for 3 minutes. Sure, it may be that you're leaving something on the table, but it's likely not going to be a huge issue. And for strength specifically, based on the latest meta regression by Robinson et al. That looked at specifically proximity to failure, you can probably get away with doing some heavy but not very close to failure sets for your strength work. So you could go in, do a single at RP 6 to 7 or RIR 3 to 4 for your squat. Do a couple of back off sets that won't require a ton of rest in between because you will be quite far from failure. And then following the other tips, supersetting, doing drop sets, doing all your accessories in the most time efficient manner. Obviously using the tips that we've talked about for hypertrophy and implementing them for your accessories will make things super manageable. But if you're a strength pilled individual who just cares about strength, you want to go in and out the gym in no time, a few heavy sets, 3 to 6 heavy sets per lift per week are likely to be enough for you to make meaningful gains. Do those, adjust and add as time availability permits, but keep in mind that it's likely that for 6 to 12 weeks, you're going to make amazing gains, maybe not optimal gains, but still solid enough gains without spending too much time in the gym. And that's it for strength.
Beautiful. You crushed it. Why don't we move into some Q&A? I will hit us off because the first question is about powerlifting, and you're the resident strength lifter here. Nathan Beckett on a platform I'm assuming is Facebook. I would love to hear your thoughts on some ideas for time-effective powerlifting and power building. How can you milk the most strength gains out of your workout without being someone who spends hours in the gym? And how would you then modify that for a mixed power building approach?
The best response, well, 2 responses. One, check my previous response a second ago. And the other response is check out the power building episode that we released before this one where we cover power building. I think power building can be organized in a way where things are very manageable as far as time efficiency goes. I'm not going to repeat exactly what I just said, but essentially hit 2 to 3 heavy sets at the beginning of your training, very specific to 1RM training, to 1RM strength specifically. So in 1 to, I'd say 3, if even 5 rep range. Do that. Don't go to failure. Don't have a squat single that requires you to get hyped and have 6 people around you and you barely make it and then you need 10 minutes to rest for your next single. Keep things at least a couple of reps away from failure, and then combine some of the time efficiency strategies we mentioned for all your hypertrophy work, and you could be looking at near optimal strength gains and even closer to optimal hypertrophy gains. Like if you really sit down and just plan everything beforehand versus just going in the gym and trying to make your current program fit those parameters. If you make some adjustments, I wouldn't be surprised if you can have your cake, eat it, buy another cake, eat that, and then complain to the Stronger by Science support team for gaining weight from unnecessary cake eating suggestions.
Hey, let's go. I think you killed it. I think our last 2 podcast episodes are essentially answering this exact question. I think if you combine the tips we gave for making hypertrophy training more time efficient and some of the tips we gave for making strength training more time efficient, congratulations. You have a time efficient power building approach.
Thank you. I'll read the next question to you, and then we can just go back to back. So Joel Phillips from Facebook, not from the Facebook group, not from working at Facebook. How do you reconcile the research suggesting that drop sets are roughly as effective as straight set training for hypertrophy with the rest time research that might indicate that maintenance of volume load in later sets is an important driver of hypertrophy stimulus, i.e. drop sets should lead to a much lower volume load per individual drop set?
Sure. So I'm going to give you a couple of answers there. The first one is based on our meta-analysis actually by Singer and colleagues on rest times. With rest times of less than 60 seconds, the effect size associated for hypertrophy is around 0.4. The effect size associated with hypertrophy from 1 to 2 minutes of rest between sets is closer to around 0.5, going off memory. With drop set research specifically, we see that we observed similar hypertrophy from an additional 30% of drop sets as an equivalent number of straight sets. So essentially, you need to do 30% more drop sets to make up for the difference in stimulus. The difference in stimulus between resting for less than 1 minute and 1 to 2 minutes in the single meta-analysis is also around 30%. So I think that kind of paints the picture pretty well. That one, each individual drop set is less effective than each individual straight set with a regular rest interval. That much is clear because it seems like you need around 30% more sets with drop sets to get to the same muscle growth. We also have research on rest time suggesting that's the case. With minimal rest time between sets, less than 60 seconds, that does result in less hypertrophy than 1 to 2 minutes. So that all plays well together. And finally, I think the consideration with drop sets is, as I mentioned earlier, I think no one here at Trauma by Science, speaking for Greg and Pak too here, is a fundamentalist effective reps enjoyer, meaning to say that we think that it is only the last 5 to 8 reps before failure, or whatever you want to call it, that truly matter for hypertrophy. It's more gradual than that. While the last rep before failure might be a bit more effective than a few reps before failure, rep per rep, it's probably not a light and day difference. And so drop sets, which allow you to train past failure on each subsequent drop set, those reps might be slightly more effective on average than if you were just doing a traditional set for those first few reps, right? So when you combine these few things, that resting for a bit less time, like under 60 seconds, is around 30% less effective than resting for only 2 minutes, and the fact that drop sets allow you to train past failure essentially, which slightly increases how effective each individual rep is, that kind of explains why we see similar hypertrophy from around 30% more drop sets compared to the equivalent number of straight sets. So yeah, that's my personal take. I'm open to being proven wrong by facts and logic by the Honorable Dr. Pak.
Yes, not many facts and definitely not any logic here to counteract that. I definitely agree there.
Cool. So let me hit you with the next one.
Hit me.
We have MH. I assume that's how you pronounce it. I assume that's not a real name. On Facebook, who asks us, I fear that what I'm curious about there won't be any data for. So, in the absence of longitudinal data, what does your, albeit highly educated gut tell you? How long can we use these sorts of strategies before lack of training time becomes the limiting factor in creating new training adaptations? What evidence can we look for as individuals to determine if this is a significant factor that's holding us back?
So if I understand it correctly, that person is saying, okay, when can we actually tell that not having enough time in the gym is actually now costing us or killing our gains, right?
I think so, but I don't know. Give me your answer first and I'll follow up.
It's a tricky question because based on the current evidence on all the training strategies to minimize time spent in the gym that we discussed, it does seem that the evidence is there for them being effective for hypertrophy for similar timelines like traditional sets or straight sets, or we're talking like 8 to 12 week time periods. But the way you'd go about assessing whether time is an issue, I think you'd have to look at how that's affecting things like training volume and intensity of effort, more specifically proximity to failure. I don't think time spent in the gym itself as a sole variable would be what you'd look at. But if you are finding that for whatever reason you cannot do supersets, or you're not getting enough volume in, or you're unable to train hard enough, I think that would be the first way or the main way that you'd determine whether time efficient training or time in the gym is your main limiting factor. Aside from that, I don't have much else to say.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. I think the question asker had two components to his question. The first one is an inbuilt assumption that time-saving techniques become less effective over time, which I think we don't have the evidence to suggest that. Like, I don't think antagonistic paired supersets are only effective for so long, and then they become less effective, and your time starts holding you back more than before, all else being equal. I don't think the effectiveness of these techniques really decays over time. I don't think it's novelty mediating these things necessarily, and so I think that assumption needs to be challenged. And so I would say I could see a factor of time playing a role in the sense that as you become more trained as a lifter, eventually you may or may not benefit from doing more volume overall. And if you still have the exact same amount of time to train, these techniques will only compensate for that so much. But I think that inherently these techniques do not become less effective over time, so that's not really a consideration. And I think that it essentially comes down to there is an amount of training time per week that any given individual would need to have to maximize their progress. If they have any less than that, we can use time-saving techniques to compensate for it to a large extent, but they are reducing their potential progress to some level. And that remains the case even down the line as you become used to these techniques. That doesn't change. So yeah, that's basically how I see it. Does that make sense?
Yep, definitely. So I'll hit you with the next question. By Randy D718 from Reddit, can you give us an example of a 30-minute, 45-minute, and a 60-minute push-pull routine? Give us a sense of what things you'd prioritize for what time frames. What would you add if you had more time? Maybe you would just do a little bit of everything and add sets. I have a ready example if you want me to give it.
Please do.
So this is from an up-and-coming free program that I'll be releasing. I'm not going to plug this here, but this is how it goes. This is a superset base routine. So the first day, you'd be doing push and pull, essentially. Incline dumbbell press, supersetted with bend over dumbbell rows, dumbbell chest flies, supersetted with dumbbell pullovers, cable lateral raises, supersetted with cable rows, and last, dumbbell overhead tricep extensions, supersetted with dumbbell bicep curls. The number of sets and reps depend on how much time you have available. I've allocated about 4 sets to each exercise, and the rep range is around 8 to 12 reps at 0 to 2 RIR. So that would be an example of a relatively quick push-pull day. Obviously, just by adjusting the number of sets, you'd be looking at more or less time. So this could be a 30-minute day, could be a 45-minute day, could be a 60-minute day. As we alluded to, the majority of exercises there are compound exercises with some exceptions. Actually, half are compound exercises. And yeah, that would be a push-pull example. As far as legs goes, now I'll pass the baton to you in a second for legs, but an easy way. So what I've done here is I have some straight sets, so 2 straight sets for quad, so a squat pattern exercise, so 3 straight sets followed by a hip hinge exercise, so a squat, a leg press or a hack squat followed by a Romanian deadlift or another hip hinge exercise, and then we have a superset in the form of leg extensions and seated leg curls, or reverse Nordic curls and seated leg curls again. But what are some other leg exercises you could add to that?
Yeah, so I'm not going to go too much into what a push-pull legs routine will look like, because that would take us probably an hour plus to actually flesh out and make intelligible over a podcast. So apologies for not directly addressing the question here. But for a leg day specifically, since that kind of complements your answer, I think as a one-off tip, compound lower body movements can broadly be categorized into 2 types, and both of them are essentially a leave one muscle group out type. You have the hip hinge type, which trains your hip extensors really well and your lower back. So that would be hamstrings, adductors, gluteus maximus, and your erectors, but doesn't train your quads. So that's leaving the quads out, quote unquote. And then the second category would be any sort of squat or lunge type pattern, which could be anything like a leg press, like a split squat, like a pistol squat even, which trains your quads, glutes, and adductors really well, but it leaves the hamstrings out. Right? So as far as the major muscle groups of the lower body, both of these movements can train most of the lower body really well, minus like one muscle, which is either the quads for the hip hinges or the hamstrings for the lunging/squatting style patterns. So a really quick workout to train most of your lower body pretty well would be one of these 2 categories, so either a hip hinge or a squat style movement, then complemented with an isolation movement for whatever muscle it didn't train. So you'd combine the split squat or lunge type movement with the leg curl to train the hamstrings, and you'd complement the hip hinge type movement with some sort of quad isolation movement, since the quads didn't get trained very well. And all of a sudden, in 2 exercises, you've trained most of your lower body pretty effectively. Could you add in some calf work? Absolutely, right, if you wanted to. Could you add in some training for slightly smaller muscles that don't get trained very well? Like, for example, if you did a split squat or a leg press, you wouldn't train your rectus femoris all that well. Sure. But if you're talking strictly in the context of like a minimalist leg day in 30 minutes, that can take you a really long way. And if you do 2 of those a week with a slight variation to kind of remedy some of the small muscles you didn't target, and just 2 half-an-hour leg days a week, you can target most stuff pretty well. You're not going to win any Mr. Olympia titles, but it is going to get you some decent growth. So yeah, since we're not going to be able to respond to this question in too much depth, I think that's about as good as we can do.
Yeah, agreed. I'll read the next question to you, since I answered the question myself. So this is by Stimg. Let's spend 10 minutes now pronouncing the name. From Reddit. Unilateral movements always seem to fall by the wayside when I am pressed for time because they basically take twice as long. Are there any clever strategies for squeezing those in?
Yeah, so I'm going to put forth a hot take that Mr. Stimg, I'm going to keep pronouncing it in random ways until we figure it out.
Stamg.
I'm going to put forth a hot take that Mr. Unnamed shall potentially disagree with, and that's that I don't think unilateral or bilateral movements are inherently much more time efficient than one another. While bilateral movements involve half the number of sets, they also typically involve a bit more warming up. For instance, I can warm up for a set of pistol squats within about 2 minutes, or maybe even less than that if I wanted to. A set of barbell squats with both my legs, it would take me substantially more than that, just as far as setup goes and everything else. The absolute load being used is quite a bit larger. Additionally, I think it sounds like the question asker might be making the mistake of resting for a full rest interval between each side. So they do a set for the left side, they take a full 2 minutes, let's say, and then they do the right side, and then they rest for a full 2 minutes, and then they do the left side. In reality, test this out, see how your performance is, but you might just be able to go back and forth with minimal detriment. So what I mean by that is, do your left side, maybe take 15 seconds of rest, and do your right side, and then rest for 2 minutes, and then repeat. You probably don't need to take as much rest between sides as you think, unless you feel super out of breath from one side. And if you do, it might be a rep range issue or an exercise issue rather than specifically a lack of rest between sides. I personally think you can go pretty heavy on split squats and pistol squats, for example, and that actually works pretty well. So yeah, that's what I would generally say about why unilateral movements seem to fall by the wayside for this question asker. Any additional information?
No. You hit the nail on the head again. You keep hitting that nail on the head all the time.
Let me ask this the next question.
Cool.
WolfpackEng22 from Reddit. Truly one of our favorite listeners.
Totally not us, by the way.
Indeed. For the time crunched, early morning lifter, how can you make your warm-up meaningful to your training goal? Can you incorporate prehab or even meaningful volume into the routine?
I'm not a big fan of the word prehab as far as direct evidence goes for prehab being effective in preventing injury or rehabbing injury. We don't have much, if anything. And I would just say that, hey, do a very quick warm-up as we discussed and get into your routine. Now, if you have been prescribed prehab by a professional for whatever to treat an injury, by your physiotherapist, actually, no, there's more to the question. I need significantly more warm-up for morning sessions, and it often seems like it's taking up too much of my session time. But if I neglected activation, prehab, and multiple warm-up sets, I get all types of aches and pains, particularly if I'm lifting heavy. I think that you may be suffering from somewhat of a nocebo here when it comes to activation, prehab, and multiple warm-up sets. I'd say that if you're doing your heavy work, just doing a few more sets, a few more light warm-up sets with the modality that you're training in should suffice. And I'd just be skeptical with drawing this sort of connection between activation, prehab, and aches and pains. Now, obviously, I cannot tell you that you're not feeling any aches or pains, but my recommendation would be, if you're squatting, do a few more warm-up sets with a bar without spending too much time on them. Rest for 20 to 30 seconds between each set. Bang those out relatively quickly, and then potentially leave 1 or 2 extra reps in reserve for your heavy work. That may help you feel a bit better. But the way the question is phrased, it may also be that you may be in the gym not fully ready to go yet because of your sleep or whatever. There's other things that could be leading to you feeling that way, but I'd be confident in saying that just doing a specific warm-up and slightly extending that before your heavy lifting should suffice. And activation and prehab are probably more on the waste of time side of things, especially if you're pressed for time, right? Like if you said, hey, I have all the time in the world, these things make me feel great, even if they're a waste of time as far as adaptations goes, all for doing them. But in your case specifically, I'd just prioritize specific warm-ups and just spend a bit more time there. That's it. It's very difficult to answer it with a conclusive recommendation without obviously knowing you and knowing all the terms and conditions that go on with your life.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think obviously none of this is meant to be medical advice, and if you're consistently experiencing pains, it might be worth seeing a physiotherapist about it. But just on a lack of context, lack of knowledge about the situation basis, I do think activation and prehab and excessive warm-ups may not be the best use of your time strictly from a driving adaptations perspective. If you visit a physiotherapist or a medical professional and they recommend doing this, that is all well and good, but just without any additional context, that's what I would say. Cool. Next question from Matt Soskins on Facebook. I want to know about optimizing versus diminishing returns. From Carpinelli and Otto, 1998 to today. If I spend twice as much time lifting, how much more results do I get? What if I do half as much twice as often? How do I maximize efficiency of time in the gym?
Now, it's important, obviously, for the latter part of the question. We've gone through it for 1 hour and a half now. But for the first part, I wouldn't necessarily look at just time as the variable that will determine your gains. Obviously, if we're making the assumption that time equals volume, then that's a whole other kind of worms. Let me ask it back to you. What would you say here? Actually, I'll semi-reply and then pass the ball to you. So if you are sacrificing a lot of training volume by spending less time in the gym, you could literally be looking at 50% less gains. There's more evidence coming out soon on the relationship between volume and hypertrophy that sort of pushes back that minimum effective training dose to as far as percentage of gains acquired goes. Now, that was a weirdly structured sentence, but what I'm trying to say is that our current understanding up until recently, based on the Basval and more specifically the Schoenfeld meta-analysis on training volume and hypertrophy, showed that with a couple of sets, your first 3 sets will get you roughly 50 to 60% of your gains. However, it may be that you need roughly closer to 10-ish sets to get somewhere around 30 to 40% of your potential gains. So with that in mind, it will depend on how you've actually structured your sessions, what time efficiency training techniques you're using, and how much volume you're able to get. So it is not that if I say, oh, I spend 60 minutes in the gym and Milo spends 120 minutes in the gym, therefore Milo will get twice as much hypertrophy simply because he's in the gym for longer. We could be getting the same amount of hypertrophy if I'm doing supersets and drop sets and my exercise selection is on point. And Milo is there doing, sets of 5 on squats and resting for 5 minutes per set and taking his time between each exercise. So I would view this question more from a volume side of things as it pertains to both hypertrophy and strength. So yeah, that's my response there.
I think that's pretty solid. I'm going to give you a behind the curtain sneak peek. We have knowledge of data that is yet to be published. That should be pre-printed pretty soon, to be honest. We won't go into the details because things might still change, etc. But I think as a general heuristic, when it comes to hypertrophy and volume, there's ways to get more volume in less time, as we've discussed repeatedly throughout this episode. But ultimately, doing more volume will take more time. So in this case, we'll use volume as a proxy stand-in for time. The general heuristic seems to be that doubling your volume, or how many sets you do for a muscle in a given training week, gives you roughly 50% more growth relative to how much growth you were getting before. So around 5 sets per week per muscle-ish is where you start seeing appreciable muscle growth. And then for every doubling of volume, that might give you an extra 50% of growth. Let's say, for example, you were due to gain 4 pounds of muscle in a year by doing 10 sets a week for a muscle. If you went to 20 sets a week for that muscle, you might expect 15 pounds, so an additional 50% growth. That seems to be the general heuristic that holds up reasonably well from around 5 sets to around 30-ish sets per week per muscle. Those are some of the findings. So I'd say you're essentially dealing with diminishing returns from the get-go. Those first 2 sets you do in the gym per week are going to be the most bang for your buck, the highest marginal returns. But that doesn't mean you can't still see appreciable increases in hypertrophy going higher and higher in volume, but you are fighting an uphill battle, pun intended. So yeah, doubling the volume seems to roughly result in a plus 50% hypertrophy up until around 30 sets per week per muscle. So whether or not that is ultimately meaningful and relevant to you, and you're willing to spend more time in the gym, it's up to you.
Then there you have it. That wraps up our Q&A for today. It is, I know people are like, okay, time for part 2 of this episode now. It's only been an hour and a half, but no, time efficient training, time efficient podcast, especially if you played it at 4 times the speed as the grind set recommends and you haven't understood anything, but hey, that bar looks full and you've listened to the podcast. But joking aside, this is it. We are living in a society, but we are also living in a time where making amazing gains and making a ton of gains is much more flexible and easy to do than some of us may have thought in the past. Time efficient training is not for beginners or for those that just want to make some gains. You can make amazing strength and hypertrophy gains in much less time. Obviously, some sacrifices will need to be made, but we hope that this podcast episode helps you manage your training better, still remain not just physically active, but gains active, and still be on that gain train during periods of time where life gets in the way. And the both of us at the moment are traveling quite a bit. We are in different time zones. We are obviously working and doing research and all that sort of jazz, and take our anecdote for whatever it's worth. But this is the way we've been training for the past few months, and not really feeling like we're sacrificing much as far as hypertrophy goes. Keep in mind, we are literally talking about making substantial gains, not maintaining or just getting a tiny bit, or just seeing that needle sort of move a tiny bit during busy periods. So life is good. Gains can be made even if you don't have tons of time or tons of equipment or whatever. Do your best. Follow these practical tips. And don't forget to check out strongerbyscience.com for the entirety of the Stronger by Science universe. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, and we'll see you guys and hear you guys next time.
Peace.
Peace.